Europe was burning. The galactic invaders' goal was to take over Earth, not destroy it. Nevertheless, they often carried out orbital bombardments that lay entire villages to ash. Black smoke filled the air, together with the smell of death and decay, as the Star Destroyers loomed in the background. Germany urged for speeding up the mobilization. The sudden invasion and need of military mobilization and migration resulted in engineers prioritizing on travel via the form of the newly created C-47 Skytrain. This could easily and quickly disperse American troops all around the globe. The soldiers stationed in Europe were told to look to the skies for their American comrades to arrive. The troops had made the long journey all through the night to arrive during sunrise. The men were anxious. They had never faced an enemy like this before. But they were dedicated and knew it was their duty to protect their fellow brothers. No one hesitated when they jumped from the planes. The sky got filled with the round parachutes, portraying to many the joyous image of more allies joining the cause. Soldiers and officers alike came outside to look at the spectacle. But unfortunately, the landings did not all go flawless. Some men were dropped over parts where there was still fighting going on, and several paratroopers got shot before ever hitting the ground. Even some of the planes were shot down. The crew and soldiers in it burned to a crisp. Once the Americans hit the ground, regrouped and were set, new plans had to be made concerning defense, offense, and civilian crowd control. All the higher-ups were of the opinion that civilians in the vicinity would need to be evacuated to locations not yet attacked by the invaders. The Americans agreed to overlook the evacuation, which for the most part went down smoothly, as the citizens were transported via car, boat, and plane. Sometimes the Galactic Army received word of an ongoing evacuation, and sent in fighters to take down the vehicles. Besides the Americans, more armies joined. The Italians offered a helping hand to strengthen their numbers. Their technological power was not considered great, but their troops had heart and courage. The same went for the Canadians, who offered to help as well, as they saw the French countryside fall to tyranny of the ever so intimidating invader. And the Belgians, whose spirits were ever so cheerful, even in the darkest of hours. But their spirits could not protect them from the onslaught brought upon them by the assaulting forces of Führer Yoda. All troops bonded together across many villages in northern France to withhold attacks by droids and stormtroopers. The forces sent by Yoda were much larger this time, and close-range combat unfolded on the streets and in the houses of the French villages. The Canadians, Germans, and Japanese tried to hold the southern part of the village from incoming stormtroopers, while the Belgians and more Germans tried to hold the west. The western flanking force of stormtroopers were in a much better position and took many soldiers out. The Italians, Brits, and Americans fought an incoming attack of battle droids in a village elsewhere. The Italians had trouble fighting them off, and many died by droid blaster fire. The battle took a great toll on both sides. Casualties were high, and results of lost battles were devastating. The stormtroopers performed house searches to find remaining civilians who did not make it in time for the evacuation, or who simply did not want to leave their home. Their choice to stay got many of themselves killed as they were executed shortly after. At that same time, the planned counterattack set up by Montgomery and Rommel was launched in Africa. The attack was named Operation Fedum Vindictum, meaning Iron Vengeance in Latin. The attack consisted of a huge assault force of armor and troops from all different nations. Their purpose was to strike back hard, but what was hoped to be a swift victory turned out into a bloody nightmare. The droids, who had taken control over the oasis town after it was secured by the Tuskens, had set up anti-tank turrets whose blasters shredded the incoming tanks. The droids stationed at the border were few in number and relatively weak. The large amount of attacking infantry and armor dealt with them quickly. Some of Earth's units had reached the edge of town and tried to gain access to one of the bridges by crossing the street. But the AT turrets of the droids punished these infantry units severely as well. They kept the assaulting troops under constant pressure, as their infantry was forced to hide behind their tanks, or what was left of them. The few Tusken Raiders still stationed in town fought alongside as well, but their rifles could not match the destructive power of the droids' AT weapons. Another attempt to cross the open street was made. With wrecks and rubble covering the area, some troops managed to get as far as the riverbed. But for some, their spirits were broken, seeing all the death around them, and some soldiers started to flee. Seeing the fleeing men crawl through the grass was not good for morale, but there were still those who continued fighting. The front AT turrets had been taken out, but it were the rear turrets that now posed a threat. The ground was cluttered with bodies, wreckage, and craters. The once lush oasis had been turned to hell on Earth. All men who still had some fight left in them bonded forces to perform one massive final assault. They had lost almost all their armor, so they were desperate. But there were still several anti-tank turrets operational, creating a seemingly unpenetrable wall of death for the infantry. Huge explosions ripped the soldiers to pieces. The infantry's rifles were simply too weak to pose any threat. To make matters worse, the droids had set up one of their own tanks at the town's center. It had a good overview, and its deadly shots were in range to do devastating damage. The men tried again and again, but each attempt ended with blood. And thus, the coalition of Earth was unable to retake the oasis town, and Operation Fedum Vindictum was labeled a failure. The desert had turned into a graveyard, and Yoda was pleased with this news. The first towns had been captured. Now the next step was to cripple Earth's infrastructure by targeting and occupying important locations like airfields, rail yards, and ports. He would once again assign a large-scale assault, this time being supported by some of his strongest units, the Death Troopers. They were highly trained, incredibly accurate, and knew no fear. They were willing to give their life, if necessary, for their glorious Führer. Hail Yoda!